language, as we have heard several times today, like Kulkuro or Mikeo or so, then why isn't it that we have conferences on Quo Vadis Kulkuro studies or Quo Vadis Mikeo studies or so? I mean, what really is different is that Egyptian really is a culturally extremely important language with probably 24 Egyptological departments in the world, right? Or how many are there? Maybe even more. I don't know. So I think what it's the fact that this discussion is even taking place, one has to recognize Egyptian is very special in that there's a long tradition of philologists and therefore also linguists working on the language. And in fact, there's so many of them that they can afford to be relatively isolated. Unlike the people who study Kulkuro or Mikeo or so, it's just impossible for somebody studying Rama or all of Colette's students who work in South America have to go to these typology conferences and so on, simply because there's not enough others. So in a way, the relative isolation in which Egyptian linguistics existed in the 20th century, I think had to do with the luxury of being able to afford that. So it's kind of interesting to see sometimes, when you're rich, it also means that you can afford to ignore everything else. So Egyptologists have been rich traditionally, and so I think there's many things that happen because of the external circumstances, not so much because of any inherent problems. Also, I think hardly anyone thought that Egyptian is this really special language. So it's just, if people pay you to focus just on this language and to go to conferences when you meet other people who study this language, to develop a particular mindset. Maybe it's not that bad somehow. So sometimes I feel that if there's a particular group, they can afford to develop their own ideas and discuss them without being influenced too much by fashionable developments elsewhere and so on. So maybe Egyptologists should not worry too much about fitting into the mainstream of typology or so. Maybe they should be able to continue some of their own stuff.
Yeah, well, I was thinking along the same lines, in the sense that, of course, you have a rich tradition in Egyptology, obviously, and people produce a lot of interesting work. But then, of course, it's also a problem of making things accessible to a wider public. And probably this is one area in which Egyptology could do a bit more. For instance, for me, when I prepared this talk, and also before that, I was left with different grammars and so on. And of course, it takes a certain effort to actually get into the details. Then, of course, at a certain stage, you become aware, oh, now really, I would need text experience, 1 year of concentrating on lots of texts to really understand what is going on. So, making the data accessible is probably one thing. Another thing is about rarity. Sometimes I'm a bit struck by that discussion, and there was also that in linguist. This discussion. There is one type of rareness which is rarely discussed, namely where really new categories are coming in. And I think it's linguistics, up to a certain extent, doesn't offer that kind of rarity. If you look at what the grammatical categories are across linguistically, it's basically the same. Or you've just mentioned is the pre-aspirated fricatives. So there is, of course, the fact that they are pre-aspirated and there are fricatives is new, but we have fricatives, we have aspiration, and we have pre-aspiration. And we know all of that. It's just the geometry that is different. And but nothing else. Apart from that, it's probably even a bit boring. We don't see new solutions, languages in which you have, like tense, you have color, so depending on the environment, you would use, if the environment is green, you would use another suffix than if the environment is red or whatever. And probably one could think of a lot of things we never think of because our cognition works the way it does and our way of discussing works the way it does. So, in fact, I think we know about the ingredients, but probably we don't know about how they can be combined in detail. But here I think this is interesting now from the perspective of Egyptology. We also know the ingredients. We know that they changed over time. And then what would really be interesting for the typologists is to see in detail how this changed over diachronically in the history of the language. And for that, we, as Martin said, we need good, accessible, reliable, as far as it is possible to come up with reliable solutions given the limits of text we have, but good descriptions.
You complained about some topics. You complained about some synchronic topics not being covered, not having been covered in Egyptian, but you forgot to mention that many others have been not only described and addressed, but very high level of linguistic discourse, which does not characterize many linguistic families. Some of the troubles, I mean, what you had for you, working for you, is exactly this high level of linguistic discourse, because you had a very high point of start, which is not everyone, only in ancient languages, it's a very rare thing.
If I may ask a question about Colette's presentation, and in favor of the cooperation between linguistics and Egyptologists. From your experience as a linguistic, would you expect the ancient Egyptian determinatives, the classifiers, to be pronounced? You know, as Egyptologists, we don't insert them into our transcription, transliteration, and we don't pronounce them. And from the, I thought from the example that you showed for the language, that they do pronounce it. Yeah.
Right. In Hakaltek, it's like a determiner. You must put one in front of every referential noun. So yeah, they are in the language the way they are the numeral classifiers that are very well known. So two long canoes. But in Hakaltek, with the noun ones, it talks about the material things are made up. So it's two good canoes. The numeral classifier would be by shape. So you'd say two biped people or two biped chickens in Tzotzil. Well, we say two animal chicken or two human man. So the semantic categorization is different depending on the system, but they are an extra morpheme you have to put in. The fact, yeah, the interesting fact seems to be that the hieroglyphic determinatives did not get transcribed into Coptic. So you had a visual type of language, which, that's it, it was just visual. Our work with the sign languages, there are human languages that are entirely visual. So whether it's visual or written or oral doesn't make a difference with what's going on in the brain. So it seemed to have been in the brain of the scribes that did it at the moment of writing. And in spoken language, you can have gesture. So there are studies of gesture that are, you can say yes. Okay. I mean, the gesture can override what you say. So the fact that there are visual things that are part of the communication, we can see in other circumstances. So I am not, what is really striking is that, I mean, I was laughing my head off when she was showing me the examples because it was just like Hakaltek. So it was from Trinidad's head in Hakaltek in the 70s to Lyon in 2008, and I kept asking questions, expecting, you know, don't you have something for wood, and you have this, and then she would decline the thing. And so, you know, once the system goes, it's a particular system. It's for concrete objects, it's by the shape or by the material. I mean, the categorizations are very similar, including crazy things like unique classifiers. One classifier for just one So all the animals are animal. In Hakaltek, the dog is its own classifier. But then in numeral classifiers in Southeast Asia, the elephant or the tiger is not in the category of animal. So obviously those categorization systems tell you something about the culture, which is an interesting, and whether people pronounced it or not, I don't know, I'm not too. But I think sign language, I think gesture, you know, sort of, to say these are cognitive languages, you know, they're languages in our cognition system, and then the means we have to transmit them can be different. I had a couple of comments about, who said about noun incorporation? Well, one thing I did not say that is in our article, one striking feature of the determinatives is that they have a complete grammar in them. And one of the most striking things is that they do noun compounding and verb incorporation. And I was using Marian Nathan's. So the system of determinatives, if that is a feature of the general language, of the spoken language, of what we speak, is reflected in the classifier system. So that would be an interesting. And about the ingredients, sorry, I really have a problem. About whether we are finding new categories going around the world. I tell you, coming from the 70s at MIT where they were doing affix hopping and things like that, and I hit Hakaltek. VSO languages they hadn't seen. They told me it was not possible. You know, it was just a little cuckoo thing, that it was really SVO, and there was a late scrambling rule at the last minute. So I have seen so many categories appear in the last 30 years, 40 years. We now are, after this period of very intensive work that, you know, particularly in Latin America, I wrote a whole thesis and did not say the word ergativity. In the 70s, the word did not exist, and Mayan languages are ergative, and those constructions that are so funny that I wrote about, they're called antipassive. But you can date the year the word arrives on the scene, and then people turn around and say, oh, so that's what I have. Associated motion, how old is that? 10 years? Ergativity is about 30 years. Narrativity, evidential, evidentiality. I mean, all these categories are just coming up. Now that we have them, we feel like, well, they've been around forever, but no, we had them in the description, and we call them the "an" suffix with capital letters, saying, don't know what it does, but you know, I have this "an" suffix, and then 10 years later you say, wow, it's an antipassive, and now it's all clear. You know, it's an evidential. Now it's all clear. Now the work of from the 70s to, I mean, the last 20, 30 years has really moved linguistics with new phenomena that we just had not seen. And Indo-European, for Pete's sake, is such a really weird family. I mean, it's all by itself. Who does that kind of stuff? You go around the world and you don't have auxiliaries and things like that. So linguistics seems to me based on Indo-European languages. So, of course, it's striking. You go out there, you know, you don't. I remember in the 70s a teacher of Kaqchikel in a normal school in Guatemala, one of the few people teaching his own language. And I was so pleased to have somebody interested in the language and not worried about, you know, it didn't have articles. That's okay, your language can have no articles. Then he prepared me for 2 or 3 lessons. I'll have to tell you something about my language, but later, you know, first learn this and learn that. Then the secret he finally told me he was so embarrassed about, he didn't have auxiliaries. You know, so I am sick, it was I sick. And he went on, he had prepared a speech sort of saying, you know, we're not primitives. I mean, we understand each other when we do it that way. But, you know, he knew Spanish and he knew Kaqchikel. And he felt embarrassed. And he said when he was trying to teach Kachikal to even Kachikal people, they'd say, well, why bother with this language? It's primitive. It doesn't have auxiliaries. And you can't imagine the mentality has changed over 20 or 30 years.
Well, probably I wasn't as naive when I said that there is probably a different type of rarity we are not aware of. Of course, there has been a lot of work being done, anti-passage and so on, you name it. But in fact, I think it's still about what is geometrically possible in a certain space of variation, nothing more. And somehow I think one could possibly find it. But another question, completely different question in terms of Quo Vadis Egyptology. Your comment on classifiers and cognition in Egyptian languages. I was wondering whether it would, in one way or another, be possible to do some sort of cognitive experiments, as we do also with other forms. If you have why don't we do cognitive experiments with these classifiers? Yes, but I think this would really be interesting with, of course, well-informed literate specialists of Egyptian read texts. Yeah, I'm aware. who read texts every day, let's say, and then you present them texts in which you change the classifiers. You put in a wrong classifier, or you put in a rare classifier.
Cambridge,
things like that. So I think that would just be a wonderful new approach to Quo Vadis Egyptology in a way. So yeah.
I actually tried once to do experimental work on Hakeltek classifiers because, as you heard, if you're not a real linguist, if you don't do experimental stuff, and you have to have statistics, and you have to... So my lab told me I couldn't do these traditional grammar kind of stuff. I had to get modern. So they pushed me to apply for money for an experimental. So I did an experimental, 2 summers of experimental work on the difference between numeral classifiers in Tzotzil, in another Mayan language, and noun classifiers in Hakeltek. So in Tzotzil, they classify by the shape. And in Hakeltek, they classify by the material. So we had sorting things. We had 3 objects. The 3 objects, 2 of them had the same shape, and the other 2 had the same material. Right? So we had a pen made of wood with a knife, and then you had a frying pan. So the knife was metal, the frying pan was metal, but then the knife and the pen were long and rigid. And we tried with the Tzotzil people and sort of said, this is a Max Planck experiment, right? The Lucy experiment with Yucatan. And so if they were supposed to be speakers were supposed to be cognitively impressed by their classifiers enough to put long and rigid things together, because the language said 2 long things, and then the hypothesis was, what would the Hakeltek do? And it was just everything and nothing. But we filmed the people. That's where I saw another time how you need to look at your informants. There were those that were so bewildered to do an experimental thing that they looked terrorized about, which way should I put this? So there was a result. But if you looked at the face of those ladies, they were terrorized. They weren't doing the right thing. They didn't understand the test. There were those that did it by shape. And so I said, the teachers, some of them did that by shape. They were good speakers. When I interviewed them afterwards, they said, yeah, well, that's what they teach you in school. So the Spanish schooling had overrun. And then I had a number of people do absolutely crazy thing, that you would have an egg animal with a rock, right? And a plate, or anyway. And then they would put, no, it was the metal cup and metal spoon, what was it, and milk or something. And it ended up, it was a scenario. They said, oh, because when we go to school, they give us milk in the cup, so they put the milk and the cup together. So in fact, they had little scenes in their head. Anyway, it was such a mess that we never wrote up the results, because all the cognitive experiments that have been done are done with university students in Chicago or Paris or somewhere, and those guys, they're so disciplined, you tell them, you know, and they do. You get Indians in front of the camera handling material, whatever. You don't know where the cognition is. You know that they don't. I don't myself trust too much. I have no idea how the Max Planck produces so much experimental stuff that comes out right. I am totally incapable of getting my informants to just line up and do what I ask them to do.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more comment or question. So, I guess it's time to thank everyone for a really excellent day. And I'd like to point out, that we have time now for a break of 45 minutes, and afterwards we're going to hear Sebastian Richter give the H.J. Polotsky annual distinguished lecture from 5 until 6. And then afterwards we have a small reception for everyone. So see you in 45 minutes.